What would you do if a complete stranger left you a crumbling estate, only for you to discover its rotting walls were quite literally stuffed with a decades-old mystery? This isn't a movie script. It is the terrifying, twist-filled reality one woman faced when she finally turned the rusted key. Arlette Fenton sat at her cramped kitchen table in South Boston, staring at the heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the return address of a law firm she didn't recognize, Gable, Reed & Associates, located in Bath, Maine. It had arrived via certified mail, requiring a signature that had thoroughly annoyed her landlord. Inside was a dense, legally complex summons that made absolutely no sense to a 34-year-old middle school history teacher. According to Houston Gable, the senior partner of the firm, Arlette was the sole beneficiary of the estate of one Alfred Carmichael. She had never heard the name Alfred Carmichael in her entire life. Assuming it was an elaborate scam designed to siphon her meager savings, Arlette initially tossed the letter into her recycling bin. But a nagging curiosity and a quick internet search that confirmed Houston Gable was a highly respected, heavily credentialed attorney in Sagadahoc County compelled her to fish it out. 2 days later, she requested a personal day from her school and drove 3 hours north. She soon found herself sitting across from Houston in a mahogany-paneled office that smelled faintly of lemon polish, old paper, and expensive cologne. Mr. Bart Carmichael was a deeply private man, Houston explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He stood a remarkably thick man in a file across the polished desk. He passed away 3 weeks ago at the age of 89. He had no surviving wife, no children, and his extended family is entirely estranged. His last will and testament, updated only 6 months ago, explicitly named you, Arlette Marie Fenton, as the sole inheritor of the property at 421 Willow Creek Drive, along with its entire contents and surrounding acreage. But why? Arlette asked, her voice tight with genuine confusion. I don't know him. My parents never mentioned a Carmichael. My grandparents are all gone, and they lived in Ohio, not Maine. But Houston offered a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile, leaning back in his leather chair. Alfred was not a man who explained himself to anyone, including his legal counsel. I asked him the same question when he sat exactly where you are sitting to draft the document. His exact words were, "She is the only one who can be trusted with the burden." I assumed naturally that you knew what that meant. Arlette shook her head slowly. I have absolutely no idea. Well, Houston sighed, opening a small drawer and retrieving a heavy brass key that looked like a prop from a Gothic horror film. He placed it carefully on top of the file. The property is yours. However, I must warn you, Miss Fenton, the house has been severely neglected. Alfred lived in only 2 rooms for the last 20 years of his life. The rest of the estate, well, it has been left to the harsh coastal elements and the passage of time. Furthermore, the property taxes are significantly in arrears. If you choose to accept this inheritance, you inherit the financial liabilities attached to it. Despite the logical part of her brain screaming to walk away, the historical mystery was far too potent for her to ignore. The following morning, Arlette drove through the winding back roads of Bath to 421 Willow Creek Drive. The house sat at the end of a long, deeply rutted dirt driveway flanked by dying elm trees that looked like skeletal fingers pointing at the slate-gray sky. It was a massive 3-story Victorian monstrosity. Its paint, once a vibrant nautical blue, had peeled away to reveal gray, rotting wood beneath. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously in the middle, and thick vines of aggressive ivy had choked the windows on the eastern wing, plunging the interior into perpetual twilight. Unlocking the heavy oak front door, Arlette was immediately hit by a wall of stagnant air. It smelled of mildew, stale tobacco, and an underlying scent of something distinctly metallic, like a jar of old pennies. Motes of debris danced in the single shaft of pale sunlight that managed to pierce the grime-caked entryway window. The sheer volume of clutter was visually staggering. The grand foyer was stacked floor to ceiling with yellowing newspapers, some dating back to the late 1970s. Antique furniture was shrouded in dingy canvas sheets, looking like silent ghosts congregating in the parlor. As she carefully picked her way through the narrow, maze-like pathways carved into the hoard, The absolute, suffocating silence of the house pressed uncomfortably against her eardrums. Eventually, she found the 2 rooms Alfred had actively inhabited at the back of the house, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration, and a small, cramped den where a simple military-style cot was pushed against the far wall. A single Farthenate bulb hung from a frayed wire on the ceiling. On the small wooden desk sat a heavy manual typewriter and a neat stack of blank paper. Beside it, a framed black-and-white photograph caught her eye. She picked it up, wiping the glass with her thumb. It showed 2 young women laughing in front of the carnival Ferris wheel. One was a stranger with dark, curly hair. The other, Arlette recognized with a sharp, paralyzing jolt of shock, was her late grandmother, Beatrice Fenton, looking no older than 20. Arlette sank onto the edge of the stiff cot, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Alfred Carmichael wasn't a total stranger after all. He was intimately connected to her grandmother, but how? And why had her grandmother, a strict, fiercely practical woman who had lived her entire adult life in Cleveland, never once mentioned knowing a man in Maine? The burden Halston Gable had warned her about suddenly felt very real, incredibly vast, and terrifyingly heavy. Determined to uncover the historical truth behind the photograph and her unexpected windfall, Arlette took an immediate leave of absence from her teaching position and temporarily relocated to the dilapidated Victorian. Her first order of business was making the environment safely livable and clearing the suffocating mountains of fire hazard debris. She hired a well-reviewed local contractor, a burly, pragmatic man named Thomas Miller, to formally assess the structural integrity of the massive house and help haul away the worst of the hoarding. The first week was physically and mentally exhausting. Dumpster after commercial dumpster was filled with rotten wood, ruined textiles, and endless stacks of damp, illegible newspapers. The coastal town of Bath was a tight-knit community, and word of the city stranger who inherited the crazy Carmichael place spread rapidly. Arlette frequently noticed pickup trucks slowing down as they passed the end of the driveway, local faces peering curiously through the overgrown foliage. On the 8th day of renovations, the narrative took a sharp, highly unsettling turn. Arlette was in the kitchen, aggressively trying to scrub decades of hardened grease from the cracked linoleum floor, when Thomas called out from the formal dining room. His voice didn't have its usual booming, good-natured cheerfulness. It sounded strained and unnaturally quiet. "Arlette, you need to come in here and see this." She dropped her scrubbing brush, wiped her hands on her faded jeans, and hurried down the dark hallway into the dining room. Thomas was standing rigidly by the massive stone fireplace, his heavy steel crowbar resting against his leg. He pointed wordlessly to the ornate oak wainscoting on the left side of the hearth. He had pried away a large section of the rotting, water-damaged wood to inspect the lath and plaster behind it. "I was checking for deep water damage near the chimney flashing," Thomas explained, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The wood sounded wrong, hollow. Not just hollow like a normal gap between wall studs, but entirely empty, like a cavern, so I pushed my flashlight through the broken plaster. Behind the jagged hole in the wall was a hidden cavity, roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. It wasn't empty. Stacked neatly inside, row after row, were dozens of heavy galvanized steel lockboxes. They were completely pristine, indicating the wall had been sealed tightly and deliberately for a very long time. Arlette stepped closer, her breath catching painfully in her throat. She reached into the dark, cold space and pulled the nearest box out into the light. It was astonishingly heavy, sealed shut with a thick, brass padlock. "There have to be at least 40 or 50 of them in there," Thomas muttered, stepping back and crossing his arms defensively. "Miss Fenton, maybe we should stop and call the local police. You don't know what this old man was involved in. Drugs, stolen antiquities, mob money?" "No," Arlette said quickly, surprisingly protective of the deceased man she had never actually met. "Not yet. We don't know what it is. Please, Thomas, just help me get them out." It took them over an hour of grueling labor to extract all 47 lockboxes from the wall cavity. They lined them up in perfectly straight rows on the dusty floorboards of the dining room. Arlette ran back to the small desk in Alfred's den, desperately hoping to find the master key. She searched the desk drawers, checked under the thin mattress of the cot, and finally, taped discreetly to the heavy iron bottom of the typewriter, she found a thick metal ring holding a single, oddly shaped brass key. With trembling hands, she returned to the dining room and knelt before the first box in the row. Thomas stood nearby, watching the process with a complex mixture of deep apprehension and intense curiosity. She slid the key into the padlock. It turned with a loud, satisfying mechanical click. Arlette threw open the heavy lid. Inside there were no tightly wrapped bricks of cash, no stolen gold bars, and no illicit substances. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with immaculate, perfectly preserved documents and strange, meticulously hand-drawn topological maps. She pulled out the top stack of paperwork. They were property deeds, but not for the crumbling house they were currently standing in. They were original deeds for vast, highly valuable tracts of commercial real estate scattered across New England, some dating as far back as the late 1960s. Attached to each deed with rusted paperclips were detailed, handwritten financial ledgers tracking millions of dollars in obscure, untraceable cash transactions. "Good Lord," Thomas whispered reverently, leaning over to read the top document over her shoulder. This guy wasn't just some crazy, isolated hoarder. He was wealthy, unbelievably wealthy. But the staggering financial wealth wasn't the most shocking discovery. Beneath the stacks of ledgers, Arlette found a thick, black, leather-bound journal. She cracked it open to the very first page. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was sharp, jagged, and meticulous. October 14th, 1978. The network remains completely secure, but Hammond is getting dangerously restless. He knows about the contingency plan. If he ever finds out about Beatrice's bloodline, the whole foundation crumbles, and they will take everything. I have to hide the primary ledger, where he will never think to look. Arlette stared fixedly at the name. Hammond! The name rang an immediate terrifying bell in her memory. Just yesterday morning, she had found a thick, premium cardstock business card wedged into the rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway. It contained a typed note expressing an aggressive, borderline demanding interest in buying the property, as is, for well above market value, in cash. The name embossed in gold lettering on the card was Gregory Hammond. Suddenly, a remarkably loud, sharp series of knocks echoed fiercely from the heavy oak front door, making both Arlette and Thomas jump out of their skin. Arlette carefully and quietly closed the lid of the lockbox, her heart racing at a dangerous speed. She walked silently into the foyer and peered through the grime-streaked side window panel. Standing on the sagging porch, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place amidst the rot and ruin of Willow Creek Drive, was a tall, silver-haired man. He was holding a sleek leather briefcase and tapping his polished Italian leather shoe impatiently against the rotting floorboards. She unlocked a deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just a fraction of an inch, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" The man offered a perfectly measured smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating gray eyes. "Miss Fenton, I'm very glad to finally catch you at home. My name is Gregory Hammond. We need to have a serious discussion about the structural liability of this house. And more importantly, we need to talk about what Alfred Carmichael stole from my family 40 years ago. If you want to leave this town with your life intact, you will unchain this door and let me in." Tension hung thick and suffocating in the dusty foyer as Arlette stared through the narrow crack of the front door. The man on the porch, Gregory Hammond, exuded an aura of predatory wealth, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the peeling paint and rotting wood of the Carmichael estate. "I am not interested in selling," Arlette stated, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic hammering of her heart against her ribs. "And as for whatever you believe Alfred Carmichael stole from you, that sounds like a matter for the authorities, Mr. Hammond. Not something to be handled through intimidation on my front porch." Gregory's measured smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened sneer. He took a deliberate step forward, the toe of his polished shoe pressing aggressively against the doorframe, as if preparing to shove his way inside. You are vastly underestimating the situation, Miss Fenton. You are a middle school teacher from Ohio, out of your depth and playing with fire. That old hermit ruined my father's legacy. He took something that belongs to the Hammond Trust, and I will not let a naive outsider walk away with it. Open this door. Before Arlette could respond, a heavy, calloused hand clamped down on the wooden door right above her shoulder. Thomas Miller, the contractor, loomed into the narrow line of sight. He still held the heavy steel crowbar in his right hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. "The lady told you she's not selling, buddy," Thomas growled, his deep voice resonating in the cramped space. "And she told you to leave. Now you can walk back to whatever expensive car you drove up here in, or I can call the local sheriff. I grew up with him. He doesn't take kindly to city suits threatening folks in Bath." Gregory Hammond's eyes darted from Arlette to the imposing figure of the contractor, correctly assessing that physical intimidation was no longer a viable tactic. He slowly withdrew his foot from the threshold, smoothing the lapels of his charcoal jacket with a perfectly manicured hand. "This is a mistake, Miss Fenton," Gregory said, his tone dripping with absolute certainty. "You have inherited a war you cannot possibly win. I will have my legal team tear this estate apart brick by brick until I get what is mine." He turned on his heel and marched down the decaying porch steps, disappearing down the overgrown driveway. Arlette slammed the door shut, immediately throwing the deadbolt and leaning her forehead against the cool, solid wood. She took several deep, ragged breaths before turning to Thomas. "Thank you, truly." "Don't mention it," Thomas muttered, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "But Arlette, whoever that guy is, he isn't playing around. We need to figure out exactly what is in those boxes before he comes back with a judge's order." They retreated to the dining room, surrounded by the 47 lockboxes. Arlette picked up the black leather journal, her hands trembling slightly as she turned past the first entry. For the next several hours, the two of them sat on the dusty floorboards, deciphering Alfred Carmichael's meticulous, jagged handwriting. The story that unfolded was a staggering chronicle of corporate greed, unimaginable courage, and a decades-long stalemate. In the late 1970s, Gregory Hammond's father, Richard Hammond, was a ruthless real estate magnate, expanding his empire across New England. He utilized a complex network of shell companies to aggressively force working-class families into foreclosure, seizing their properties for pennies on the dollar to build lucrative commercial developments. Beatrice Fenton Arlette's fiercely practical grandmother had not always lived in Ohio. In 1978, she was working as a senior legal secretary at the very firm representing Richard Hammond. Over several years, Beatrice had quietly gathered a mountain of undeniable evidence, forged signatures, bribed municipal judges, and the primary financial ledger that documented every illegal transaction the Hammond Trust had executed. Realizing that the local authorities were deeply embedded in Hammond's pockets, Beatrice knew she couldn't simply hand the evidence over to the police. She needed someone outside the system. Enter Alfred Carmichael, a brilliant but cynical private investigator known for handling unseemly corporate espionage. Together, Beatrice and Alfred pulled off an astonishing heist. They didn't steal money. They stole the Hammond Trust's most vital, legitimate property deeds right out of Richard Hammond's secure vault, holding them hostage alongside the primary ledger of his crimes. December 2nd, 1979, one journal entry read, "Richard Hammond is frantic. He cannot legally claim the properties without the original deeds, and he cannot report them stolen without exposing the primary ledger that proves how he acquired them. We have him trapped in a stalemate. Beatrice has agreed to flee to the Midwest, changing her name and burying her past to protect her bloodline. I will remain here in this fortress, guarding the leverage. As long as I draw breath, the Hammond empire is built on a powder keg." Alfred had spent the last 40 years living in isolation, sacrificing his own life to ensure a corrupt billionaire could never fully realize his stolen empire. He was the ultimate gatekeeper, and with his death, Gregory Hammond believed the gate was finally unguarded. "He doesn't just want the house," Arlette whispered, staring at a stack of millions of dollars worth of commercial deeds. "Gregory Hammond needs to destroy this primary ledger before the statute of limitations resets, or before anyone realizes his entire family fortune is built on massive documented fraud." And he thinks you're just going to hand it over because you're scared, Thomas added, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He thinks you're weak. Arlette looked at the photograph of her grandmother laughing in front of the Ferris wheel. Beatrice had risked her life to stop a monster, and Alfred had given up his freedom to protect her secret. The fear that had gripped Arlette only moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing wave of determination. "Thomas," Arlette said, her voice dropping to a decisive register, "help me pack these boxes into the back of your truck. We are going to pay a visit to Halston Gable." The legal assault began exactly 48 hours later. As Arlette sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Halston Gable, the attorney's receptionist buzzed in with a frantic tone. A team of 4 corporate lawyers representing the Hammond Trust had arrived in the lobby, armed with an emergency injunction demanding the immediate seizure and sealing of the Carmichael estate pending a thorough investigation into stolen corporate assets. Halston Gable, a man who had spent 40 years navigating the treacherous waters of corporate law, didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Arlette. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Miss Fenton? Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back. The blowback will be monumental." Arlette rested her hand on the battered black leather journal sitting on Halston's desk. Next to it lay the primary ledger, the ultimate proof of Richard Hammond's crimes, which she and Thomas had securely transported the night before. "My grandmother gave up her entire life in Maine to build this trap. Alfred Carmichael lived in squalor for decades to keep it set. It's time to spring it. Send them in." Moments later, the heavy office doors swung open. Gregory Hammond strode in, radiating a smug, overwhelming arrogance. His legal team flanked him like suited bodyguards, slapping thick binders of legal jargon onto Halston's conference table. "I warned you, Miss Fenton," Gregory said smoothly, taking a seat without being offered one. "You had your chance to walk away with a generous cash buyout. Now the courts will freeze the estate. You will be tied up in litigation for the rest of your natural life, and I will recover what my father lost. Sign the relinquishment forms now, and I might allow you to keep the rotting house." Arlette didn't say a word. She simply looked at Halston Gable, who offered a thin, remarkably terrifying smile. "Mr. Hammond," Halston began, his voice perfectly level, "your injunction is based on the premise that Alfred Carmichael was in possession of stolen corporate assets belonging to the Hammond Trust." "A fascinating claim." "It is a factual claim," Gregory snapped, leaning forward. "My legal team has sworn affidavits." "Hez about that," Halston sighed, opening the top drawer of his desk. "You see, Alfred Carmichael was an exceedingly thorough man. When he drafted his will, he didn't just leave the estate to Miss Fenton. He also established a dead man's switch with my firm, authorizing the immediate release of certain historical documents to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the IRS, and the State Attorney General's office should the Hammond Trust ever attempt to seize the Willow Creek property." Gregory's smug expression faltered, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his gray eyes. "Bluffing is a poor legal strategy, Gable." "I assure you I am not bluffing," Halston replied, sliding a photocopy of a page from the primary ledger across the desk. "This is a detailed record from 1978, bearing your late father's personal signature, explicitly outlining the bribery of Superior Court Judge Mitchell in exchange for the forced foreclosure of the entire East Side residential block. We have the original ledger, Mr. Hammond. We have all 47 lockboxes containing the legitimate deeds you have illegally monetized for 40 years. The color drained from Gregory Hammond's face with astonishing speed. The arrogant titan of industry suddenly looked incredibly small, his eyes locked onto the copied page in sheer disbelief. His lead attorney reached for the paper, scanning it quickly before slowly pulling his hand away as if the document were physically burning him. "Furthermore," Arlette spoke up, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the room. She stared directly into Gregory's eyes, watching the realization of his complete ruin wash over him. "Alfred Carmichael's will stipulated that if I, as Beatrice Fenton's heir, successfully claim the estate, I have the right to disburse the contents as I see fit. I am not selling them to you, Gregory. I am handing the deeds over to a victim's restitution fund. Every single property your father stole will be systematically dismantled, liquidated, and returned to the descendants of the families you destroyed. Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The absolute terrifying reality of the trap set 40 years ago had finally snapped shut on his leg. If he pushed the injunction, the ledger would immediately go public, triggering a cascade of federal indictments that would shatter his company and likely send him to federal prison. If he walked away, Arlette would still systematically dismantle his empire, using the deeds he desperately needed to maintain his fraudulent collateral. He was completely, utterly beaten by the ghost of an old hermit and a history teacher from Ohio. "I suggest you and your counsel leave my office, Mr. Hammond," Houston said sharply. "You have a great deal of catastrophic financial planning to do." Without a word, Gregory Hammond stood up. His hands were visibly shaking as he buttoned his jacket. He didn't look back as he practically fled the office, his legal team scrambling behind him in a panicked silence. Arlette let out a long, shuddering breath, sinking back into her leather chair. The immense burden Alfred Carmichael had mentioned in his will was finally lifted. The karma, delayed for over 4 decades, had finally been delivered with devastating precision. Over the next 2 years, the coastal town of Bath watched a remarkable transformation. Arlette Fenton did not return to South Boston. Working alongside Thomas Miller, she poured the modest, legally clean funds she had inherited directly into restoring the sprawling Victorian on Willow Creek Drive. The rotting wood was replaced, the aggressive ivy cleared away, and the house was painted a vibrant, stunning nautical blue. Gregory Hammond's corporate empire slowly, publicly collapsed under the weight of federal investigations and massive class-action restitution lawsuits, exactly as Alfred and Beatrice had intended. The millions hidden in the lockboxes served their true purpose, righting the wrongs of a ruthless past. Arlette stood on her newly restored wraparound porch, listening to the gentle rustle of the elm trees, finally at peace knowing the ghosts of the past could rest. If you loved the incredible twists and the ultimate karmic justice in this story of hidden family secrets, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with fellow mystery lovers and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true crime and historical drama stories delivered every week. Let me know in the comments what you would do if you found 47 lockboxes in your wall.